She was still with her eyes closed, whispering a quiet prayer only she could hear. Her hands were pressed together the way children do when they're hoping for something they can't explain out loud. For a moment, she looked like any other 14-year-old asking for a second chance. But the place where she prayed wasn't a bedroom or a church pew. It was the front row of a Broward County courtroom, minutes before a judge would decide her future. She didn't see the way the adults around her watched with a mix of shock and worry. She truly believed she might be going home. Before we reach that moment, we need to go back. Back to the woman who survived Nazi-occupied France, rebuilt her life in Ukraine, and crossed an ocean just to help raise the granddaughter she adored. Inside their small Florida home were worn family photos, a walker by the couch, and 2 generations' worth of memories woven into the walls. It was a house that tried to hold itself together while Sofia struggled with bullying, sleepless nights, sudden mood shifts, and the heavy adjustment of a new life her father could not afford to fully treat. If someone had walked past that porch light, they would have seen nothing unusual. But that wasn't the last morning they shared. And on May 23 RD, sometime after sunrise, that home fell silent. A silence no one in that family could undo. The morning of May 23, 2023, did not rise the way that house was used to. Most days started slow there, the soft shuffle of a grandmother moving carefully with her walker, the low creak of the hallway floor, the light hum of a kettle warming on the stove. But just after 8 a.m., that calm was broken. A neighbor later told detectives, "I heard something. I just couldn't tell what. It wasn't a normal sound. It was sharp, then quiet, then sharp again, the kind of noise that makes you pause in the middle of a routine and wonder if you imagined it." She stepped onto her porch, listened again, and when the silence returned, she went back inside, unaware that those few seconds would matter later. The timeline always matters. But the most important clue wasn't on the floor. It was in the moments no one saw. Inside the house, the normal order of things was gone. The grandmother's walker, normally positioned by the couch, was lying flat on its side. A belt was stretched across the hallway floor in a way that did not match any accident or fall the investigators had seen before. A lamp was pushed out of place. Several framed photos were tilted, as if something had struck the wall or someone had moved too quickly through the space. Officers would later note in their report that nothing was stolen and no door showed forced entry. This was not the work of an outsider. Someone in that home knew more than they said. When the first responders stepped inside at approximately 8:37 a.m., they were met with a scene that froze them mid-step. According to documented police accounts, the responding officers found the grandmother on the bedroom floor with visible head and facial trauma. One officer radioed in, saying, "We have an elderly female, unconscious, injuries consistent with an assault," a line taken directly from the recorded dispatch log. Sofia stood only a few feet away, her breathing unsteady, her hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't crying. She looked stunned, as if she herself was trying to understand what she had done or what had just unfolded. An officer asked her, "Sofia, what happened here?" and she replied softly, "I don't know. I don't know." She fell. The officer's report later noted her voice lacked clarity, and her statements shifted slightly each time she repeated them. EMTs rushed in behind the officers, kneeling beside the grandmother, checking for responsiveness. One paramedic whispered, "Ma'am, can you hear me?" but there was no answer, only shallow breathing and fading warmth. When the father arrived minutes later, the scene fractured in a different way. He stepped into the doorway and saw his mother lying on the floor, motionless, with medical equipment surrounding her. He saw the officers. Then he saw his daughter. His first words, recorded in the bodycam audio, were, "What happened? What did you do? Sofia, what happened?" His voice cracked, the kind of break you hear when a person realizes two parts of their life have collided in the worst way possible. He reached out for his mother but was held back gently by an officer who said, "Sir, we need to give them space to work." Then he looked at Sofia with a mixture of fear, confusion, and heartbreak. A man torn between protecting his child and facing the unthinkable truth forming right in front of him. The paramedics worked quickly, lifting the grandmother onto the stretcher, checking her pulse again, preparing her for transport to the hospital. The officers documented the layout of the room, the walker, the belt, the overturned objects, and the inconsistent explanations coming from the only other person present during the attack. But the deeper answers were not in the objects. They were in the timeline, the sounds heard by the neighbor, the injuries observed by paramedics, the changing statements, the history of tension inside the home. By the time the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, the question was no longer where the grandmother was. It was why this happened. And in the minutes that followed, detectives would begin to uncover details no one had prepared for. Detectives began piecing together the timeline before the ambulance even cleared the street. They moved through the home with slow, careful steps, gathering every detail that could help them understand what unfolded between sunrise and the 911 call at 8:32 a.m. Bodycam recordings captured their early observations, an officer saying, "The layout doesn't match an accidental fall," another noting the belt on the floor, and a third asking Sofia the same question twice to see if her answer changed. Crime scene notes documented the exact position of the walker, the distances between objects, and the angle of the grandmother's injuries. One detective wrote, "No sign of forced entry. No signs of outside involvement." And that one sentence in the report changed how detectives viewed the entire case. Everything they needed to investigate was inside those walls. Everything began with the people who lived there. As part of reconstructing the sequence, investigators sat down with the father, a man already breaking under the weight of a reality he did not know how to face. His voice cracked several times as he described the months before the incident. He said, "She stopped sleeping through the night. Some days she'd be withdrawn, other days she'd get angry over nothing. I tried to help her but I couldn't afford the kind of care she needed." He told detectives about the bullying at school, the tears Sofia hid, the sudden changes in her mood, and the long stretches where she refused to leave her room. He also spoke about the cultural pressure of starting over in a new country, saying, "She never fit in like she hoped. She struggled with everything here." The father's words painted a picture that didn't excuse the violence but helped explain how the tension had been building long before that morning. It was the kind of testimony that made detectives stop writing for a moment and simply listen. The evidence review added another layer to the timeline. The grandmother's injuries, as confirmed by medical notes, were consistent with blunt force trauma, not a fall, and certainly not an accident. There were no broken latches, no damaged windows, and no sign that anyone had entered the home without permission. The walker found near the bedroom did not match the grandmother's typical path of movement, suggesting it had been pulled or pushed. The belt on the floor also raised questions. One officer asked Sofia, "Was this used? Did you grab this?" And she responded softly, "I didn't mean for anything to happen." The inconsistencies in her explanations, recorded in the police log, strengthened the case that the violence came from inside, from someone the grandmother trusted. Still, detectives had to piece through every possibility, every detail, every object in that home. Facts were forming, but emotions were rising faster, especially from the people closest to the case. To understand the deeper layers, investigators consulted juvenile behavioral specialists who reviewed the family's statements and the months-long behavioral decline that had been documented. One specialist said, "A child under chronic stress, without treatment, can reach a breaking point over something that wouldn't make sense to an adult." Another explained how sleep deprivation in teenagers can magnify anger, confusion, and impulsivity, especially when combined with bullying and cultural displacement. They emphasized how untreated emotional decline can escalate into moments of intense reaction. Moments where logic disappears and the child acts without understanding the full weight of their actions. Their observations didn't justify what happened, but they offered insight into how a teenager could reach such an irreversible moment inside her own home. It was the kind of analysis that made the room fall quiet, the kind that forced detectives to consider the human cost behind every line of their reports. By the time the full timeline was assembled, from the neighbor's statement to the body cam notes to the father's testimony and the medical findings, investigators knew what happened. They had the evidence, the sequence, the interviews, and the timelines. But why it happened, no document could fully explain. And as detectives gathered the last pieces, one detail emerged that would push the case into its next chapter, a detail that raised more questions than answers, and it was waiting for them in the next room. The moment investigators finalized the evidence, the case shifted from a home filled with unanswered questions to a courtroom where the full weight of the justice system stepped in. On June 1, 2023, just days after the incident, prosecutors made a rare and heavy decision for someone her age. They announced that 14-year-old Sofia would be charged as an adult. In Florida, that meant she would face the same criminal process as someone twice her age, with adult penalties and adult procedures. During the announcement, one prosecutor said on record, "Given the severity of the injuries and the circumstances, the state will proceed with adult charges." That single line sent shockwaves through the community and set the tone for everything that came next. And as difficult as the decision was, prosecutors weren't finished. Not even close. Court documents that followed painted a picture of months of tension leading up to that morning. School records described sudden behavioral outbursts, teachers who reported moments of disengagement, and counselors who noted that Sofia struggled with social adjustment and refused to talk about the bullying she mentioned at home. One school staff member, during an interview with detectives, said, "Some days she was calm. Other days she looked angry and exhausted. It's like something was building inside her." At home, her father detailed frequent arguments, emotional volatility, and moments where Sofia's frustration seemed to overwhelm her. But none of the documents fully explained the scale of the violence that occurred on May 23. Everything looked like pieces of a larger puzzle that didn't fit together until it was already too late. As the case reached the public, reactions spread quickly. Local residents struggled to understand how a young teenager could be responsible for the death of a grandmother who survived war, migration, and the harshness of rebuilding life in a new country. At a neighborhood gathering near the family's street, one woman said to a reporter, "She was just a kid. I don't understand how something like this could happen in a home so quiet." Another community member added, "That grandmother walked every morning. She smiled at everyone. She didn't deserve this." The shock wasn't just about the crime, it was about who committed it. And as the news traveled across Broward County, the community found itself torn between sympathy for a struggling child and heartbreak for a life that had been taken. Inside the courtroom, Sofia's behavior raised even more questions. Some days she sat quietly, barely looking up, answering simple questions with a soft yes or no. Other days she appeared numb, staring forward without emotion, as if disconnected from the gravity of the charges. A courtroom observer later told a local station, "It was like she wasn't fully there. You couldn't tell if she understood what was happening or if she was shutting down. There were moments where she seemed strangely detached, blinking slowly, avoiding eye contact, twisting her fingers together until her knuckles turned white." When asked by the judge during an early hearing if she understood the charge of manslaughter, she replied in a shaky voice, "I understand, it wasn't supposed to happen." But those words brought no clarity, only more confusion about her state of mind. As the hearings continued, Sofia was escorted from the courtroom in handcuffs, wearing the oversized jumpsuit issued by the Broward County Detention Center. The sound of the metal door closing behind her echoed across the hallway, and even the officers escorting her could feel the weight of what her life was becoming. By the time the jail doors closed behind her, childhood was over. And what happened next would set the tone for the rest of her life, a turn in the case that neither the public nor the courtroom was fully prepared for. In October 2024, the case that had shaken Broward County reached a moment no one in that courtroom would ever forget. Sofia walked in with her wrists chained at her sides, the oversized juvenile detention jumpsuit folded around her thin frame, and for the first time since her arrest, she seemed lighter, almost hopeful. Her attorneys had prepared her for a no-contest plea to manslaughter, explaining that she wasn't admitting guilt but accepting the consequences without a trial. One of them whispered, "This is the best option you have," and she nodded slowly, trying to hold on to the idea that this decision might lead her back home sooner than she feared. Her reaction told the courtroom everything, and nothing. She looked like a child clinging to the last inch of daylight before the door closed. The courtroom held a grief deeper than any sentencing guideline. Her father took the stand with shaking hands, wearing the same expression a man wears when his life has been divided into a before and an after. As he began recounting the story of his mother, the woman who had survived Nazi-occupied France, rebuilt herself in Ukraine, and crossed the ocean to care for a granddaughter she adored, his voice cracked. She was strong, he told the court. She lived through things most people can't imagine. She didn't deserve to die like this, not in her own home. He paused to steady himself, then added, "And my daughter, she wasn't always like this. I watched her change. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't afford the help she needed." Those words cut through the room, hanging in the air like a confession and a plea all at once. You could feel the weight of a man who had to bury a mother and sentence a daughter in the same breath. When the judge finally looked up, the room fell into a silence that felt heavier than the case file sitting on his desk. Sofia lifted her eyes toward him, her expression softening with the quiet hope only a child still carries. She whispered a small prayer as she waited, her lips barely moving. The judge began by acknowledging the tragedy of the grandmother's life and death, then addressed the complicated layers of the case, the behavioral decline, the untreated emotional struggles, the father's limited resources, and the irreversible outcome of that morning in May. "You are 14, he told her, "and this is a tragedy with no winners." Her attorneys leaned closer as he prepared to deliver the sentence, and for a moment, she blinked slowly, as if bracing herself for mercy she thought might still arrive. But the sentence was clear. She would serve up to 3 years in a maximum-risk juvenile facility, followed by strict supervision until she turned 21. The judge explained that any violation, any slip, any refusal to comply could result in her being transferred into the adult system, where the penalties ranged from 10 to 15 years. "This is your window to change," he said, "and you must use it." As those words filled the courtroom, Sofia's face shifted. Her shoulders lowered. Her hands tightened. A quiet realization washed over her young features as the truth settled in. Hope left her eyes before the words left his mouth. And what happened in the moments that followed would lead the entire courtroom into a silence everyone felt but no one dared to break. Long after the courtroom emptied and the reporters packed their cameras, the story settled back into the people who lived it. The grandmother's legacy became the quiet thread running through every conversation, every case file, every reflection that followed. She was a woman who survived Nazi-occupied France, rebuilt herself in Ukraine, and crossed an ocean believing she had finally reached a place where life would calm down. Neighbors remembered her as gentle, always smiling during her morning walks, the kind of woman who waved at every passerby even if she didn't know their names. A family friend told investigators, "She fought through history. She fought through life. She shouldn't have had to fight in her own home." Her story became a reminder of the strength she carried and the tragedy of the place where her journey ended. And even after everything, the memory of her footsteps in that hallway stayed alive in the people who knew her best. For the father, grief became a weight he carried every single day. He was a man torn between two roles, raising one child while burying the parent who helped him raise her. In an interview following the sentencing, he said quietly, "I lost my mother, and I lost the version of my daughter I used to know." His life became a series of responsibilities no parent should have to shoulder alone. Yet he visited Sofia, brought what he could, and tried to hold steady in conversations that often felt too heavy for someone trying to heal from two losses at once. The emotional cost followed him everywhere, through his long work hours, the empty chair at the kitchen table, and the quiet moments at home where everything reminded him of what used to be. He carried guilt for not being able to afford the care Sofia needed, regret for the signs he didn't understand, and a heavy love that never left him despite the pain. His grief lived in the spaces where both mother and daughter used to stand. Sofia's future was placed entirely in the hands of the juvenile system, a world built to rehabilitate but firm enough to enforce accountability. Her sentence required participation in therapy, behavioral programs, and long-term monitoring designed for high-risk youth. Staff who worked with her noted that she sometimes attended sessions quietly, barely speaking until coaxed, while other days she opened up about the bullying, the loneliness, and the feeling of being overwhelmed before the incident. One counselor stated in a report, "She shows moments of insight, but she struggles to maintain emotional balance." The possibility of rebuilding existed, but only if she complied with every requirement, followed every rule, and remained stable through every stage of supervision. A single violation could shift her case into the adult system, where the sentence would stretch far longer and the environment would be far harsher. Her entire future rested on choices she wasn't allowed to take lightly anymore. What lingered after the hearings were the unanswered questions that stretched well beyond one family. The case forced people to confront the gaps in mental health access for immigrant households trying to build a new life in the United States. Specialists pointed out that early intervention might have changed the trajectory for a child showing signs of emotional decline, but without resources, families often fall through the cracks. The justice system faced its own debate. How to hold a child accountable for an irreversible act while still recognizing the developmental limits of a 14-year-old's mind. Community discussions grew around how to prevent similar tragedies, how to support struggling teens, and how to detect warning signs before they escalate into moments no one can take back. Every part of this case left behind a conversation about what could have been done earlier, and whether the systems meant to catch struggling children acted fast enough. And as time moved forward, the house where everything happened remained a symbol of what was lost. A neighbor passing by months later said quietly, "It still feels heavy when you walk past it." Inside, the grandmother's shoes were still by the door, untouched, waiting in a place where she once stood every morning. Her story still sits heavy in that house, in her family, and in the questions that followed. And the question that lingers is simple. How do we protect the children who need help before tragedy arrives?